Now, our next guest today, Nicole Perlroth, literally wrote the book on cyber warfare. Nicole is an award-winning cybersecurity reporter with the New York Times and a renowned author. In her latest book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyberweapons Arms Race, Nicole analyzes zero-day threats and threat actors. Now, we all have been talking about ransomware today for the last hour and a half, and we know it's a wake-up call for many organizations, for boards, and for C-level leaders. The public is asking where the threats are coming from and what corporations and governments are doing about it. So as we come together and create solutions, the private and the public sectors really need to be brought to the table to collaborate and to collectively help build ransomware resilience. Nicole, welcome to our virtual CXO Summit stage.
So, hi everyone, can you hear me now? Thank you so much for having me.
We can. Our audience is anxious to hear your perspective, so please take it away and tell us what we're up against.
So first of all, thank you for having me and thank you for entertaining these discussions. I feel like they are critical right now. I joined the Times more than 10 years ago, just a few months after Stuxnet was discovered, actually. And I was hired to be the Times cybersecurity reporter. But as time went on, I realized that cybersecurity was always a bit of a misnomer, that really I've been the Times digital espionage and digital sabotage reporter, and that we've all, without anyone telling us, really been living through the post-Stuxnet era when every nation state, possibly with the exception of Antarctica, has been developing its own set of offensive cyber capabilities, some for surveillance, some for sabotage, and an entire market has crept up to meet them. And I think what we're seeing right now with ransomware is in some ways sort of inevitable, but also the culmination of what we've seen over the past decade, when people with no technical skills whatsoever can launch ransomware as a service against a target. And we're all seeing in the United States what I think is just how vulnerable we are to some of these attacks. But I thought I would just walk you through some of the adversaries, both nation state and transnational adversaries and cyber criminal groups that we're up against. So, it was not long after Stuxnet that we saw Iran pop up in some of the DDoS attacks on American banks and Wall Street, the Shamoon attack on Saudi Aramco, which was only 2 years after Stuxnet was discovered. And when I went back and interviewed several of the intelligence officials who were involved in that response, what they said was, we never expected them to catch up so quickly. And we never let our imaginations go to this place of realizing that some of our adversaries didn't necessarily need a Stuxnet-like sophistication to cause that level of damage. They just needed rudimentary wiping code to hold, in what was in that case, the world's richest oil company hostage with malware. And from then, what we've seen is every major attack after Aramco has been in some ways a twist on the previous attacks playbook. We saw North Korea hold Sony Pictures hostage, not just damaging 70% of their servers, but leaking out executives' emails. Then we saw Russia's hack of the DNC and the leak of emails there just ahead of the 2016 election. We've seen ransomware be used by both nation states and transnational actors. We are still trying to understand, in some cases, the connections between the two. In Russia, we're trying to understand whether these ransomware groups are just enabled by the state because Russia refuses to extradite them, and because the Kremlin still sees cyber criminals as a national asset in some cases. That was the takeaway from the Yahoo indictments, when we saw that the actors were really 4 guys, 2 FSB agents and 2 cyber criminals, and the cyber criminals were allowed to do the dirty work, basically steal these credentials and profit off them on the dark web. But that if they came across the email account or password for someone who worked at the State Department, for instance, they were expected to pass that over to the FSB. So we've seen that sort of murky relationship play out for a long time. And now that we're seeing these widespread ransomware attacks, we're all asking, how do we stop this? How are we this vulnerable? How do we deter these attacks? Can traditional diplomatic norms deter these attacks when the groups are cyber criminals and are these transnational actors? Many of them are not even based in Russia. So these are really the most complicated issues of our day. China, when I first started at the New York Times, I had the opportunity to actually embed with our security team when the Times was hacked by a Chinese APT that we came to affectionately call the Beijing summer intern, because he would roll into our networks at 9 a.m. Beijing time and roll out around 5 in search of our sources. And back then, a lot of the Chinese APT group attacks we were facing were all enabled by phishing attacks. And now that is no longer the case. We see more and more and more of these Chinese APTs leveraging 0 days in Microsoft Exchange systems and Pulse VPN to conduct these attacks. And we all know that that makes them much harder to defend against. And we see also in China, we see them basically telling their security talent, you're no longer allowed to go to Western style hacking conferences. And if you do find a 0 day, you need to give the state right of first refusal. I was really, my eyes were opened. I think it was earlier this week or maybe last week. They're all starting to blend together at this hacking competition in China, in Chengdu, where these Chinese security engineers were just dumping 0 days in Safari, in Chrome, in Windows on stage and demonstrating really what we're up against. If the state has the ability to mandate that those security engineers give the state right of first refusal on those 0 days, we're in for some trouble here. And I don't think we've really opened our eyes to just how quickly the threat from China and other nation states has escalated. Now, that being said, all of my reporting, I have looked at classified documents, and I've conducted hundreds of interviews in this space. And although I don't have a security clearance, I still believe that the United States has the best offensive cyber capabilities in the world. Nobody has pulled off anything close to Stuxnet over the last 10 years, but they're getting closer. Some of the attacks that really stopped me in my tracks were the Russian attack on the Saudi petrochemical firm a couple of years ago, where they went as far as to use 0 days in Schneider Electric safety locks to basically dismantle the safety locks, the last thing you would need to do before you trigger an explosion. I think NotPetya caught us all by surprise. I think the twin attacks from Russia on Ukraine's power grid caught us all by surprise. And the other thing is, what's clear is that just having the world's best arsenal of offensive tools has not been a sufficient deterrent. It has not stopped the attacks that we're seeing on our networks every single day. And in fact, I'd go as far as to say that even though we are the top dog on offense, we are also now among one of the most targeted nation states on earth. And in some ways, you could argue among the most vulnerable, because we are among the most automated, because we are introducing more automation and more complexity into our networks, because we've been baking vulnerable software into our critical infrastructure, especially over the past decade at accelerated rates, just because we could, without ever really stopping to ask ourselves, should we be baking this software into our most vital systems? So these are complex challenges, and I am not technical, but I am a close observer of the threat landscape. And I think one thing that can be said about ransomware is that in some ways it really is a blessing in disguise, because it is pen testing the United States right now. It is showing us just how vulnerable we are. It is giving us very powerful visuals into that vulnerability. I don't think many of us will forget the footage of people panic buying at the pump because of the Colonial Pipeline hack, or flights getting grounded, or what happened to meat supply and the price of carne asada on our menus after the JBS attack. What I will not soon forget is talking to nurses at a hospital in Vermont when they were held up with ransomware, and they said, I don't understand how everyone is not paying attention to this. One nurse said that the only thing that came close to the experience of being under a ransomware attack at her hospital was working the burn unit after the Boston Marathon bombing. I mean, chemo patients couldn't get their cancer treatment because the protocol of who needed to get what had been completely wiped out and was being held hostage by Eastern European cyber criminals. And I think we just saw what could have been possibly the first death from a ransomware attack of an infant at a hospital. So finally, we have no choice but to deal with our digital vulnerabilities. Finally, we're seeing ransomware at the top of the agenda when President Biden went to go meet with Vladimir Putin in Geneva. Finally, we're talking about things like zero trust and a software bill of materials and data notification laws and potentially international norms around this space. There's currently a working group at the State Department that is developing a menu of consequences for these attacks with our partners. And unlike previous efforts, I do have some optimism that that will bear some fruit by the end of this year. So, the conversation has definitely been elevated. The questions we're seeing from policymakers in these committee hearings is much more nuanced than anything I've seen over the previous decade. Just this morning, there's now a story in the Wall Street Journal that reports that the Commerce Department is finally going to require licenses for anyone who wants to sell intrusion software to governments overseas. And it would look at this problem that I've been reporting now for a few years of governments that technically are our allies, like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, who are not only getting some of our best hacking talent from the NSA in some cases, but also a lot of our tools. And finally, they're saying we really need to have a more stringent vetting process for this, which I do think is a step in the right direction. So this is where we are. And I don't have a whole lot of optimism short term. I do think we're in for a lot of short-term pain before we start hacking our way out of this mess. But I will say that the team in place right now at the White House, at CISA, is an excellent team by all accounts. The problem is really structural and political. We toss around this figure, but I still haven't gotten to the bottom of whether it's entirely accurate. But I do think it's still true that the vast majority of our critical infrastructure in this country is in private hands. And some of those operators are large-scale utilities like PG&E that really do understand the nature of the threat and do have the budget and resources to put in place many intelligence agencies, essentially, that can track APTs, that can deploy the latest and greatest intrusion detection software and software that can detect anomalous behavior and conduct regular inventory checks of their networks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately, too much of our critical infrastructure is things like the water treatment facility in Oldsmar, Florida, that didn't have two-factor authentication enabled and was still using Windows XP, or Colonial Pipeline, which forgot to deactivate an old employee account and never had two-factor authentication switched on those accounts. And so unfortunately, I think what we need to do next is grunt work. It is really scanning for not just the vulnerabilities in the technology, but in the configuration and the processes that we put in place on those systems, and making sure that we're asking ourselves, should this thing be connected to the larger network or the internet? Do we really need to grant access to this vendor? And also, we need to start asking, zero trust, especially after SolarWinds, how do our vendors treat their internal commitment to cybersecurity? Because I have to say, after the first news broke of the SolarWinds breach, when I called employees and security talent and engineers at SolarWinds and former employees, they were very quick to say, we warned the company over and over again that unless they made a more serious commitment to their internal security, the results could be cataclysmic. And the results have been cataclysmic. And if you ask anyone in positions right now that would know, are you confident that we have even eradicated the SVR from these systems? The answer is no. Unfortunately, we know the SVR pretty well. They were responsible for twin attacks on the State Department and the White House in 2014, 2015. And when I interviewed the people who were brought in to remediate, they said, Nicole, this was like hand-to-hand digital combat. It's not as if we would find a hacker in a digital hallway and they'd scurry off. They fought to keep their place. At one point, they took over investigators' net witness tools and manipulated it so they wouldn't find other SVR backdoors. So that's the actor we're dealing with right now who breached the Department of Homeland Security, the very agency charged with keeping us safe, the Energy Department, our nuclear lab, state, treasury, commerce, on and on and on. And what this new administration has really inherited are communication channels it can't trust. So again, the good news is we're finally talking about zero trust. This is something that people in the industry have been talking about for more than a decade, but finally we're talking about what does that actually mean on a practical level, and how do we actually implement it? So that is in some ways the good news. That's the only good news I have for you. It's just that the awareness around the threat is much more sophisticated than I think it ever has been. And finally, the thirst and demand for solutions is higher than it ever has been. So with that, I'll probably stop talking and let you ask some questions. But again, thank you so much just for having me and raising this awareness around the threat.
Nicole, thank you. That was really fascinating. We will definitely move into our Q&A portion. I actually took notes while you were speaking, so let's go with this. So 0 days have become a critical component of American espionage and war planning. And you were once quoted, if I may read that quote, the most vivid, tangible piece of this was the 0 day market, the fact that governments, including our own, were paying hackers to turn over 0 day exploits and not to get them fixed, but to leave them open for espionage and surveillance. And that always struck me as a very clear moral hazard. So my question to you is, can you explain the significance of the statement and the critical impact to all of those that own and deploy these 0 days?
Well, I have to tell you, it was incredibly frustrating from my little perch at the New York Times to see just how advanced the threats were getting and just how little help we were seeing from law enforcement and the federal government. And I saw that firsthand at the New York Times. I'll never forget the day the FBI came to the New York Times and everyone briefed them on what we were seeing on our networks. And you have this sort of gut instinct of, okay, when are you going to go get the guys? Like, who are they? When are we going to see them in handcuffs? And instead they said, thank you very much. They closed their binders and we never heard from them again. And so I kept asking myself, where is the cavalry here? Mm-hmm. And what I had learned was that actually, when it comes to cybersecurity, the government, in a lot of cases, our intelligence agencies, in many cases, were making trade-offs at the expense of cybersecurity in the name of what we always traditionally considered to be national security, without realizing they had become one and the same. Government agencies were storing 0 days for espionage, for counterterrorism, for counterintelligence, and in some cases like Stuxnet, for counterproliferation purposes or to prepare the battlefield one day. And maybe that was okay 20 years ago when we were all using different technology, but now we're all using iPhones and Android phones and Chrome and Safari, and whether you know it or not, Windows. You might not have a PC, but it's now baked into your water treatment facility. So it was this moral hazard of, wait a minute, when you preserve a hole in these systems, you're not just preserving it so you can spy on the enemy, you're leaving Americans more vulnerable. And you're doing this at a time when the stakes are getting higher and higher because we are baking that same software into our most critical system. So it was this moral hazard, but it was also this security dilemma. And to our credit, I have to say, we actually were the first country to have a vulnerability equities process, this jargon, which just stands for a process whereby representatives from various US government agencies literally sit around a table. I don't know if they do it on Zoom these days, and talk about whether to keep or turn over a 0-day. And I do credit them for that, because no one in Iran, I always say, is sitting around a mahogany table debating whether to keep or turn over a 0-day to Apple or Microsoft. So we do get credit for that. And we do say we have this criteria for deciding whether to keep or turn it over. How destructive would this 0-day be in our adversaries' hands? Do we need to hold on to it for a year or 5 years? Should we continually check to make sure that this trade-off is worth it? If it were to be disclosed that we held on to this, how destructive would this be to our relationship with Silicon Valley and tech companies? How widely used is this software? Those are always the criteria we've said we've held ourselves to. But unfortunately, after the shadow brokers, whoever they are, hacked and dumped the NSA's own 0-day exploits, and they were picked up by North Korea for WannaCry and Russia for the NotPetya attack, we realized that we were not holding ourselves to that criteria. We were holding on to 0 days in Microsoft Windows, the most widely used software there is, for more than 5 years. And in our adversaries' hands, it proved incredibly destructive. I mean, companies like Merck and Mondelez and Pfizer have still not been able to recoup damages, hundreds of millions of damages in each case from that attack, because their insurers cited a war exemption and said, sorry, you were collateral damage in Russia's war on Ukraine. They didn't say it, but using the NSA's stolen tools. I mean, that is an absurd world to be living in. And so, my point in calling this all out is to say, we need to talk about the trade-offs we're making, especially when our adversaries that I just spoke to have caught up to such a degree. I really do think that the last decade is just a glimpse of what we're going to face in the next decade as adversaries catch up, as they see the ability to steal intellectual property. China obviously has made that realization, but as other countries see the opportunities there, I think we're going to start seeing that. I think ransomware is not going away. And so I think our priority really needs to shift towards cyber defense. And I think that means holding ourselves to this criteria that we've said we've held onto for a long time.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you bring up, the notion of, the matters of national security. I mean, cybersecurity is a matter of national and international security, right? There's no delineating that. So where is the cavalry? And I think that's the interesting, discussion to have around what is the correct course of escalation and remediation? Who do we call? Who is the agency responsible? Do we call law enforcement first, or who and where?
Yeah, well, there's still no 911 or Ghostbusters for cyber. There isn't. And CISA, Jen Easterly has been pretty clear on this. She sees CISA's role as really a gateway for closer public-private partnership. That is the only way we're going to get out of this mess. Unfortunately, in a free market society, we don't want the government inside private business networks. We had that discussion, I think, after Snowden, especially. We don't want the NSA sitting in Google's networks or Microsoft's or private businesses. So what that means is we need to have some kind of close collaboration while protecting civil liberties and privacy. And there was a lot of pushback to that idea after Snowden. You know, I would go to Google and they would say, we want nothing to do. We don't want to turn over any data to the NSA that we don't have to, or to the FBI that we don't need to, especially after learning that they may have been inside our servers collecting some of this traffic unencrypted. Fortunately, I think the conversation has become much more nuanced and sophisticated. You know, the government's not asking for your consumers' data, they're asking for IP addresses and malware samples, and they're asking for you to tell them and tell others in your sector when you have been breached or you do have evidence of some kind of significant security incident, so that we know that you're not being used as a conduit for the SVR. Or for Chinese cyber espionage, or for a calamitous attack on our critical infrastructure. And I think that's fair. I do think the government needs to offer something in return. You know, when I was among some of the journalists who did have access to some of the classified documents in the Snowden trove, among the documents that I saw were very detailed lists of Chinese APTs that the NSA and the GCHQ were tracking, and some of the technologies that they'd already stolen. There's no reason why that data can't be in the private sector's hands, so that we do have a greater awareness of the threat. So I think threat sharing is critical. I also think we're going to have to come up with creative ways to solve our cybersecurity talent shortage. You know, in China, what we've seen over the last decade is a lot of the cyber operations have moved away from the PLA to the sort of loose network of contractors that work at the behest of the Ministry of State Security. And I think the reason we're seeing that is, one, plausible deniability. You know, by tapping these private citizens, it gives the state a degree of plausible deniability. But I think another thing is that China's realized, listen, we need to get the best of the best talent, for these operations. Most of them are going to be in the private sector. And in China, they have the ability, the authoritarian ability, to tap those people on the shoulder and essentially do forced conscription and say, hey, tonight you're coming to Moonlight with us. We don't have that ability here. You know, we don't have the ability to tap the people at Google or Zscaler on the shoulder and say, tonight you're coming to work with us. And so what do? Because a lot of the people who do come through these scholarship programs and do commit to some kind of cybersecurity service in government, when you look at the numbers, they want to go work on offense, and who can blame them? You know, that's where the exciting stuff is. But how do we get people to not only work in defense and go work at CISA, but how do we get people to go work on this great problem of our great attack surface among critical infrastructure companies? And one of the things I propose in the book is some kind of tour of duty, where we would work with the best security talent in the security industry at technology companies and say, hey, could you subsidize this person's salary for 6 months while they go work at these water treatment facilities and make sure that they are ripping out Microsoft, Windows XP, and have two-factor authentication enabled, et cetera, et cetera. That is just a huge gap. And again, I think the only way out is public-private collaboration.
We talked a little bit about this on our prep call, you and I, and we talked about talent shortage. And I definitely, it's thematic, right? That the collaboration between the public and the private sectors, to identify, train, scale for these critical roles. I also think academia could play a significant role, right? In terms of, the new crop of talent, right? I mean, cybersecurity education and all across, just in terms of just proper cyber hygiene, even at elementary school level, all the way up through to graduate education and specialized education, and some level of consistency and standardization as well, because much of the implementation of zero trust security sometimes can be also very vendor vendor specific and driven. We want to create sort of standardization and commonality across how we approach this. So love to hear kind of, you talked a little bit about private and public sector collaboration, but what are your thoughts around kind of academia and standards as well?
Well, I think, on standards, I think everyone needs to go back and read the latest Biden cyber executive order, because I think, it applies to federal agencies and it really applies to federal contractors. For the first time, the government saying, listen, here are the NIST standards. We'll cut out the red tape. We'll let you self-certify that you meet these standards. But if you're lying to us, you're banned from ever doing business with the federal government. That is the first serious stick we've ever seen in this space. And it's worth paying attention to, because I would not be surprised if regulation follows. I really do think that in the next 5 years, I'll be generous, it's probably going to be sooner, we're going to see the equivalent of Sarbanes-Oxley for cybersecurity. And so it's critical that people start reading that now and get involved in the discussions if they want to have any say in how that regulation is rolled out. Because unfortunately, history has shown that the government doesn't have the best reputation in rolling out nuanced cyber legislation. So read that, get involved now. I think academia is critical. I think cybersecurity accountability needs to be discussed in elementary school. We all had earthquake drills in California. We do fire drills. We need to talk about the cybersecurity equivalent, especially the younger, as kids get younger and younger and are using iPad apps and getting immersed in technology. We need to talk about it. This is unfortunately not just a government problem or just a problem of a lack of investment from some of these companies. We have a huge legacy software issue to deal with, but every day a new class of students is coming into the workforce, and we need to make sure that every single one of them understands that in some way they are accountable for their organization's larger cybersecurity posture. Some of the best work I've seen in this space, or I've heard about, and I don't think it's uniform, unfortunately, is that for a while when Google made new hires, Heather Adkins would walk new hires through the Aurora attack in detail and talk about how it started, which was a combination of a zero-day attack in a Microsoft messaging service and a phishing attack, and then just basically walking people through the kill chain and showing them, this one employee clicked on this link, and 2 months later, these Chinese dissidents' Gmail accounts are being accessed by the state. We each have a role to play. And that's why I actually, cyber analogies are a nightmare. We can talk to death about cyber Pearl Harbor, et cetera. But I do think that the best analogy right now is actually the pandemic. Because like the pandemic, government policy, state policy, plays a big role. County policies play a big role in containing the pandemic. Businesses play a big role in developing the vaccine and setting their own corporate policies to protect employees from COVID. But individuals, wearing masks, social distancing, getting the vaccine also probably plays one of the most significant roles. The same is true in cyber. That's how we have to communicate about this. And I think, unfortunately, and I'm probably guilty of this too, when you're writing articles all day about what nation states are doing, you over time inevitably give people the wrong impression that this is a war thing. This is over there. This is a government problem. And that couldn't be further from the truth when it comes to cyber. So much of what we see and the threats we see are enabled because someone, it falls to a spear phishing attack. And so it's cyber hygiene, but it's also cyber education. And I spent a lot of time talking to these companies and people who run phishing simulations. And even they'll say the goal is not, to get 100% of your organization to never click on a phishing email. That's a big part of it. But then it's the response time, to make sure that you're containing it as soon as someone does click. And so, it's both the security team, but also education in tandem, and making people realize that they do have a lot of ownership and an accountability for these threats.
Yeah, no, both, I mean, both malicious as well as just inadvertent, which, you and I talked about kind of inside a threat and just ongoing security awareness and becoming sort of part of the organization's DNA, right? One of the things you mentioned, I know when we were talking, was we should make sure that every company, all hands, the CISO gives an update, right? There should be, that should just be part of the day-to-day operations. There should be, posters and signage, and just training should just be embedded. Now, it's albeit a little more challenging as we're in this hybrid work environment, but there are ways to ensure that that becomes, somewhat institutionalized. I don't know if you wanted to add, anything.
Yeah, no, I
further.
mean, that's why I love this story I did recently about Bob Lord, who was at Yahoo during those twin Russian breaches. And then after 2016, went and volunteered at the DNC and just recently left. And so we sort of did an exit interview together. And I said, what did you do? What did you do to protect the DNC in 2020? And he said, well, first of all, I had, barely the budget at the DNC that I did at Yahoo. So I had to work around that. And he said where he spent most of his technical energy was basically just doing inventory management, walking around. I called him the Marie Kondo of cybersecurity. Like he would walk around and open this server and say, does this bring me joy? No, this is a nightmare waiting to happen, and throwing it away. But also it was, basically being enabled to speak for 10 minutes at every all hands meeting, no matter what the topic was, just so people understood that cybersecurity was a priority for the DNC. Putting lists, above the men's urinal that said, have you updated your software? Are you using Signal for your most sensitive communications? Are you using a YubiKey for multi-factor authentication? Basically just reminding people every day of this checklist in their heads, to the point where he made the whole organization so paranoid that someone sent out an Excel sheet and said, hey, we want to send you these t-shirts, put your address on here in this Google Doc sheet, and no one filled it out. It was some kind of predecessor to a phishing attack. So that's all good. That's all very good stuff, and it doesn't require $100 million budget for cybersecurity. It's about culture.
No, it's so true. Nicole, I want to roll back a little bit to what we were talking earlier about critical infrastructure. You mentioned it, and I guess the statistic that's being touted is that 85% of our critical infrastructure here is privatized. Now, considering how fragmented and unregulated many of these entities are, it certainly makes us more vulnerable to cyber warfare, right, and attacks. Now, there's the other notion of not wanting to have too much government oversight as well, which we just touched upon. But you also talked about the fact that you believe us to be the top dog in a fence, right? So the thing that I guess I question or wonder about is, do you believe we have sufficient resilience built into place from a critical infrastructure perspective to sort of protect and defend? And again, a little bit of a loaded question is, and to ponder is, how do we get politics out of this mix so we can have better decision making and governance, that can prevail? So a little bit of a loaded question, but we can unpack that.
Yeah. No, I do not think that we have sufficient resilience. And I do think, and this is pure speculation, but based on everything I've seen, I think the next major geopolitical conflict will have some major cyber component built in. And I think the country that wins that conflict will look something like a digital Israel, a country that can basically continue to run its most basic functions and services and continue to innovate, et cetera, while being surrounded by hostile activity and hostile neighbors. We are not there. We are still sort of in la land about this threat. We've seen actually a lot of progress come from countries like Japan. And I think a lot of that is because they have North Korea and China breathing down their necks all the time. So for them, the threat is very real. Whereas here, we're still acting like we're an island separated by two oceans, when that's just not the case with cyber. And I think the clearest example of how vulnerable we are was Colonial Pipeline. The fact that a ransomware group could hold this company we'd never heard of, hold their IT network hostage to such a degree that it would force the company to shut down the major conduit for gas and jet fuel and diesel to the East Coast for as long as they did, shows you everything you need to know about how resilient our critical infrastructure was. And in that attack, one of the things my colleague David Singer and I got our hands on was a classified DOE assessment that said we could have only afforded as a country 2 to 3 more days of that downtime before we were in serious trouble. Primarily because actually and I hadn't thought of this before, but diesel, you need diesel to run our chemical refineries. And with those shut down and flights grounded and people being out of gas, we'd be in a lot of trouble. And so, they paid the ransom. And, what was our answer to this? Well, what was it, a month later or so, or even longer, did we learn that we were able to claw back some of that? That's not resilience.
No.
That is not resilience. And as long as that was enabled by some old employee account, that should have been deactivated and a lack of multi-factor authentication, we are in real trouble. We are in real trouble. We still don't know who hacked that water treatment facility in Oldsmar, Florida, outside Tampa, a day before the Tampa Super Bowl. But we do know that it was not hard for someone to break into that system because they were using Windows XP and get to the chemical controls and increase the level of lie. So as long as that is the case, we have a lot of grunt work to do to get to a point where we are resilient to these attacks. And, unfortunately, it's not sexy. It's a lot less sexy than offense. I think that's for sure. And a lot of it isn't the technology, it's humans. It's people ripping out legacy software and being able to sort of untangle these tangled webs of old software at these critical infrastructure facilities and being able to configure them in such a way that they can get patches when patches become available. We need to do that first. And then we also, at the same time, need to be asking serious questions of anyone who has significant access to our networks, like the SolarWinds of the world. We need to then go look at the open source code, the code that makes its way into our code. We learned that with Heartbleed. Here was the open SSS protocol used by everyone from the Pentagon to Amazon and the FBI, being managed by 2 guys named Steve in the UK who were operating on a shoestring $3,000 budget a year. That is just a picture of vulnerability. And so, I leave it to you all to talk about, technically, how do you create better resilience? How do you get these systems back up? How do you have fallback systems? How do you compartmentalize? How do you segregate? Those are more for the those questions are more for the technical audience. But I think, first and foremost, we need to talk about the human problem here, because so often these attacks come down to humans. And I think actually that was a very fair criticism of my book. When it first came out, people said, why are you focusing so much on 0 days and the 0-day market when so many of these attacks are coming in through phishing? And I thought it was a totally fair criticism. Now, in my defense, I'll say that after the book came out, we've seen a record number of 0-day attacks over the last 6 months at any other point in history. So we have to talk about both. We have to talk about sort of the dumb, low-hanging fruit and making sure we're not introducing new vulnerabilities into our software every day.
No, that's great. Nicole, let's shift a little bit. And when we have an audience there of like IT security and security leaders, key decision makers and practitioners. And I'm sure they're in vehement agreement with so much of what we've been talking about. And they're all sitting in the box seat today. All eyes are on them, right? As they modernize their applications, their IT infrastructure, the security controls to ensure that their organizations and their critical data is protected. But more and more now, these IT and security leaders who are, the geeks, right, are now being called into the boardroom to provide assessments and mitigation recommendations to boards of directors. In your research and a lot of the exposure talks that you've had and the folks you've interacted with, what have you seen in terms of like C-level leaders' readiness, technologists specifically, to successfully communicate the state of cybersecurity preparedness to their boards? And do the boards understand the sort of urgent threat of ransomware, that's imminent?
So I do think boards understand. I mean, since my book's come out, I've gotten more calls from these board advisory groups saying, can you come talk to us about this threat in a way that we can digest? And I think that is a critical need right now, is how do you, the technical leaders on the front lines in this space, communicate the severity of the threat to boards, to the C-suite, in a way that they can understand, and in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming to them. That it sounds woo-woo, but that is a dire need right now. We need people with technical skills who have leadership skills and communication skills, and also understand, the administrative problems that these executives and board members face. Of course, we would love to have a situation where you just walk in and say, the threat is real, I need this much money, and you'd wave a wand and they'd say, great, go do it. And we all know that it's not that simple. And I've talked about this a lot. I've talked about this a lot, and you'll see me. I think I was tweeting about it yesterday. We need to talk about the culture in the technical cybersecurity community. We need to talk about soft skills in the technical cybersecurity community. It is no longer okay that we just elevate the best hacker in the room to these leadership positions if they don't have the ability to communicate in a non-condescending way the nature of these problems. Because if you don't have the ability to communicate these issues to a lay audience, then forget it. You're not going to get very far. Also, coming back to the cybersecurity talent shortage, we are losing so many new entrants in this space because of some of the problems with the culture. And I've heard a lot about that from people who've reached out to me to my book to say, I really was interested. I applied for these positions, but I couldn't stand the toxic culture, in the cybersecurity InfoSec space, on InfoSec Twitter. That needs to end. We've tolerated far too much in the way of sort of bullying and sarcasm, and that's okay on Twitter maybe, but unfortunately we actually do need mature leaders in this space, people who can recruit, people who can communicate up and communicate down, and also make sure, like I think Bob Lord is a leader in this space, step up and be there at an all hands meeting, speak to this problem at all hands meetings and make sure everyone understands that they have accountability, bring people into the fold. I think that is really the only way we're going to get out of this mess.
So the call to action really is, and these technology and IT and security leaders, right, need to start to take more of an active role sort of in the definition and ratification of both standards, regulation, governance, and enforcement of cybersecurity today. They need to be playing a role. This isn't just about, people in government and people in law enforcement making those decisions. We need that collaboration. We've sort of talked a lot about private public sector collaboration as well. What words of advice do you have for these leaders today in terms of like empowering them of the role that they play, and to take an active stance?
Well, I think you should be speaking at every all hands meeting. And I think that you should be reporting directly to the board. I really believe that. I think that sounded like a pipe dream 10 years ago. I remember I did a story where I interviewed a bunch of CISOs, and they just said, I think the quote was, we're like lambs waiting to be put to slaughter. They were reporting through, the CIO or the CTO. And then as soon as there was a breach, they were the ones to get axed. Without realizing we were all breached by that point anyway. And actually people who'd been in the trenches that you want working on some of these issues. I think that is no longer the case. I think, boards, especially with ransomware, understand the threat that that cyber threats pose. And so with that, I think you need to demand a seat at the table, and you should be speaking at every all hands meeting. And you should have fun with it. Like I remember Bob told me he would have like a Bob emoji, I guess you call it, on that, checklist on the urinal, thing, reminding people
Humanizing the problem somewhat.
Humanize the problem. Yep. And don't just shame people. Unfortunately, actually, it was interesting when I would talk to people who run these phishing simulations. They said, usually the stereotype is that it's the older employees that click on phishing emails, but they said that's just not true, and that it's really younger generations of workers who come in, and their stance is, well, the NSA or China or whoever has access to everything anyway, so why do I even try?
I'm dismissive, yes.
Right. So, this problem bridges all generations.
Yes.
And yeah, so humanizing it for people is critical.
Well, Nicole, I think we're both so passionate about this topic, and I could speak to you for hours on this. And I personally have very much enjoyed our brainstorming session, our session today, as we prepared for this and getting to know you a little better as well. But we are at the end of our segment, and I really wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for joining us. We're so honored you could join us today.
Thank you so much. And I was so happy to catch the last part of the last panel. Just thank you for doing this. And it was an honor to be here.